The late February air in Fox Chase held that damp, leaf-soaked chill that settles low beside the roadside. Along Susquehanna Road, the trees were still bare, and the ground kept the quiet colors of winter. It was there, in 1957, that a small clearing became the beginning of one of Philadelphia's longest unanswered case files. What police found was not a scene of noise or urgency, but a few ordinary things left behind. A blanket, a cap, a cardboard box. From the start, the investigation moved with a strange stillness, because the first and hardest question was simply the most basic one: who was this child, and why did no one seem able to say? Detectives carried his photograph through newspapers, radio bulletins, and hand-delivered flyers, trusting that recognition might do what records could not. But as days turned to weeks, the file grew heavier, while the boy remained unnamed. Tonight, you can sit with those early pages and trace how a case can fade not from lack of care, but from time, silence, and the limits of the world around it. The first officers on the scene did what police always try to do in those early hours. They reduced the uncertainty into notes. They marked the place. They measured distances. They looked closely at the few objects that had been left behind, because when a person has no name, objects often have to speak first. The blanket mattered immediately. So did the small cap. And the cardboard box, plain at first glance, became one of the earliest practical leads, because a box could be traced in a way a memory sometimes could not. That was the first concrete turn in the case. If the child could not yet be identified through records or recognition, then investigators would have to build outward from the things nearest to him. Cause led directly to method. No family had stepped forward, so the scene itself became the first witness. Philadelphia detectives understood that the first days would matter most. In the 1950s, there was no national digital network to search in an afternoon. There were paper files. There were local reports. There were phone calls made one office at a time, and each office kept its own habits, its own folders, its own delays. Because of that, police moved in several directions at once. They circulated a physical description. They asked whether any child had recently disappeared without formal notice. They checked hospitals, welfare agencies, and precinct reports. Each step followed from the same hard fact. They could not investigate what had happened until they knew who he was. That need shaped everything. The city medical examiner's office worked carefully, trying to record what could still be known. Age was estimated, height was noted, hair color, eye color, and small physical details were written down with as much precision as the era allowed. Those details were then converted into something public, a description for newspapers, a description for radio, a description that could be repeated by officers carrying flyers from one neighborhood to another. And that led to the next development. The case did not stay in Fox Chase. Almost at once it widened. Once newspapers published the boy's image and description, the investigation depended on ordinary recognition. A barber might notice. A teacher might remember. A neighbor might pause over a breakfast table and say that face looked familiar. Police were counting on that simple human chain. It was not dramatic. It was patient. And in many cases it worked. But here, something unusual began to settle over the file. The publicity was broad, yet the recognition never came with confidence. Tips arrived, but they did not land. One caller thought the boy resembled a child seen months earlier. Another suggested a family that had quietly moved away. Someone else mentioned an orphanage, or a temporary home, or a child known only by a nickname. Each lead created motion. Each lead also created paperwork. Detectives had to compare dates, addresses, and small remembered details. Then they had to cross those against what little they knew. And because the early wave of public attention was strong, that meant the file began thickening almost immediately. You can imagine the desk, photographs on one side, typed reports on the other, handwritten notes tucked between them. A city trying to remember one child all at once, and failing in slightly different ways. That failure became the next escalation. It was not just that no one had identified him. It was that many people thought they might know, and none of those possibilities held up long enough to become certainty. So detectives made a decision. They would preserve and compare every physical clue they could, even the ordinary ones that might seem too small to matter. That meant taking the box seriously. It meant studying the blanket. It meant considering whether the cap belonged to the child or had simply been left nearby. In a case with so little to anchor it, no detail could be dismissed too early. The cardboard box drew special attention because it was specific. A box had a manufacturer. A manufacturer had shipments. A shipment had stores. And a store, if records remained, might narrow the path to a neighborhood or household. That line of thinking was practical. And because it was practical, investigators followed it. They traced the bassinet box to a retail source, a department store sale connected to J.C. Penney. That was meaningful, not because it solved anything, but because it turned an abandoned object into a commercial trail. It offered the hope of sequence. A box had been bought, taken home, used for one purpose, and later appeared in the woods for another. That meant there was a domestic story hidden inside a retail one. The problem was that commercial records in that period were not designed for this kind of backward search. Sales slips were limited, customer tracking was narrow, store memory faded quickly. So the box provided direction but not a name. Still, the consequence was important. Police now had reason to widen their canvas beyond missing persons alone. They could ask a different class of question. Who bought this kind of item? Who had an infant's bassinet box in the home? Who might have reused it? That led investigators into quieter places, row house blocks, neighborhood stores, church communities, foster arrangements, and streets where families knew one another's business only partially. The blanket suggested another line of thought. It was not an extravagant item. It was the kind of household object that belongs to routine care. For detectives, that mattered. Cases often turn on simple assumptions, and one early assumption here was that the child had not lived entirely outside human attention. Someone had wrapped him. Someone had handled his daily needs at some point. Someone had moved through ordinary domestic space with him nearby. That possibility made the silence around his identity even harder to understand. If there had been care, however limited or interrupted, where had the record of that care gone? Why had no school, clinic, or neighbor confidently raised a hand? As those questions deepened, the police response changed with them. The canvas expanded. Officers checked with schools. They contacted hospitals. They reached out to churches and children's homes. They asked about private adoptions, informal custody, short-term boarding arrangements, and foster placements that may not have been cleanly documented. Each new setting reflected a new hypothesis. Maybe the child had passed through institutions. Maybe he had lived at the edge of official systems. Maybe there had been adults in his life who never put his name where it could later be found. That, in turn, widened the stakes. The case was no longer only about one unknown child in one clearing. It had become a test of the city's memory. Could a large American city in the 1950s account for a vulnerable child if his paper trail was thin enough? The early answer seemed to be no, and that answer was not reached through neglect. It was reached through repetition. A lead came in, detectives checked it, the lead thinned, another one arrived. That one faded too. Over and over, the same pattern held. The work was active. The result was stillness. In time, even the wording around the case began to reflect that tension. Newspapers described the mystery with a mixture of concern and bafflement. Police appealed to conscience. They appealed to memory. They appealed to any parent, relative, neighbor, shopkeeper, or caretaker who might know why this child had vanished from recognition. Those appeals had a clear logic behind them. If formal record systems had failed, then human memory had to fill the gap. But memory is uneven. It favors what was spoken of openly. It loses what families hide. And it struggles most with children who move through life without stable introductions. That realization marked another quiet turning point. Detectives began to consider that the boy may have lived in circumstances where his absence would not produce immediate alarm on paper. Not every family in mid-century Philadelphia dealt easily with officials. Not every birth became a cleanly accessible record. Not every child attended school in a regular, visible pattern. And not every household welcomed outside scrutiny. So the investigation leaned harder into comparison. Photographs were shown repeatedly, descriptions were mailed and remade, agencies were asked to review their own records again, then again after that. If a straightforward missing child report did not exist, then maybe some fragment of an unrelated file might match. A welfare visit, a medical note, a school absence, a church concern. This was slow work, and the slowness mattered. In a more connected era, data can be pooled quickly. In 1957, information lived in separate rooms. A detective had to know where to ask. Then he had to wait for a reply. Then he had to compare the reply to a file already crowded with uncertainty. And all the while, the boy remained unidentified. That persistent fact produced a deeper kind of pressure. Not public pressure in the sharp sense. Something softer and more difficult. The sense that time itself was beginning to work against everyone involved. Every day that passed made recognition less likely. Not because people stopped caring, but because the ordinary rhythm of life resumed around them. New headlines replaced old ones. Witnesses second-guessed themselves. A person who almost called did not call. A family that might have known something kept private for one more week, then one more month. So investigators tried to preserve urgency by making the image visible again. The boy's photograph appeared in newspapers more than once. His description was repeated over radio bulletins. Flyers were handed out in hopes that direct contact might succeed where print had not. That decision was both practical and deeply human. A flyer placed in someone's hand asks more of them than a headline does. It asks them to stop, to look, to remember carefully, to compare one face against the hidden shelves of their own memory. And yet even that did not unlock the case. The result was a new and troubling pattern. The broader the search became, the thinner each thread felt. One tip pointed toward a child seen with adults in a crowded market. Another suggested a boy associated with a boarding home. A third came from someone certain he had once noticed a child whose appearance now seemed important in hindsight. But hindsight is a difficult witness. It edits, it softens, it rearranges. By the time detectives reached some of these accounts, dates no longer aligned cleanly, or descriptions changed in the retelling. That caused another decision point. Investigators had to choose whether to spend limited hours pursuing fragile memories or keep their attention on the physical evidence that could still be handled and measured. They did both, but unevenly. The physical clues remained stable, even if they remained mute. The memories shifted, even when offered sincerely. So the case file began organizing itself around two kinds of material: what could be touched and what could only be hoped for. That divide would matter for years. The child's image, meanwhile, continued moving through the city, in police stations, in newspaper offices, in municipal buildings. It took on a life of its own, not as a solved identity, but as an unanswered appeal. There is something especially haunting, and also very quiet, about an unidentified case in that era. No digital archive hummed in the background. No instant database linked one jurisdiction to another in seconds. There were only people, offices, cabinets, and the determination to ask one more time. That determination kept the investigation alive through the first wave of disappointment. And disappointment did come. Weeks passed without the breakthrough detectives had expected early on. The confidence of the first strategy, publish, circulate, identify, began to wear thin. That did not mean the case stopped. It meant the methods had to become more granular, more local in one sense, and more expansive in another. Officers revisited the neighborhoods closest to where the child had been found. They also looked farther outward, because there was no guarantee the place where he was left had any connection to where he had lived. That widened the map considerably. Now the case was no longer anchored only to Fox Chase. It stretched into the rest of Philadelphia and beyond it into nearby counties and institutions where children might pass through with little stable documentation. This broadening had a cost. As the map expanded, so did the number of possible absences. A boy missing from one neighborhood might be known by his full name. A boy missing from another might be known only by a first name. Elsewhere, he might be a cousin staying temporarily, a foster placement interrupted, a child in private care, or someone never fully entered into a system at all. With each possibility, detectives were forced to confront the same uneasy truth. A child could disappear into administrative gaps more easily than most people wanted to believe. That truth did not solve the case, but it changed how police thought about it. The mystery was no longer simply why no one recognized him. It was whether recognition had ever been made structurally easy. If a child lived at the margins of official notice, then even a determined search might circle around him without ever landing. By then, the case had acquired its strange identity, famous enough to be remembered, but too uncertain to move forward cleanly. And because the uncertainty centered on who the child was, every later question remained suspended behind that first one. Who was he? Where had he lived? Who had last known him by name? The file kept growing because each unanswered question generated another search. Detectives reviewed missing children reports not only for exact matches, but for near matches. They checked ages that were slightly off. They looked at photos where resemblance was possible, then less so, then not at all. They pursued families who had moved. They asked institutions to look again at their rosters. Each negative result pushed the case forward in a paradoxical way. The more it excluded, the more unusual the central absence became. At some point, that accumulation itself turned into evidence. Not evidence of identity, but evidence of isolation. The child had not simply gone unnamed by accident in a busy week. He had remained unnamed, despite repeated organized effort. That meant there was some barrier still unseen, social, bureaucratic, familial, or all three together. And once detectives sensed that, the case became heavier, not louder, just heavier. It had moved from immediate investigation into something slower and more enduring. A city had looked, a city had asked, and still the answer had not come. So attention settled more intently on the few original objects because they had not changed, and because unchanged things often become anchors in old investigations. The blanket was revisited, the cap was reconsidered, and the cardboard bassinet box, plain and ordinary, remained one of the few clues that linked the child to a specific chain of commerce and home life. If the larger world would not name him, perhaps the smaller world of household habits still might. That was the reasoning. That was the patience. And that was where the investigation leaned next, toward the box, the blanket, and the long, careful canvas that followed them into stores, homes, and half-remembered domestic spaces where a child might once have been seen and then quietly lost. The bassinet box gave detectives something rare in an uncertain case, a thing that had once belonged to a store shelf. They learned that the carton had originally held a baby bassinet sold through J.C. Penney. That mattered because a store item has a path. It is made somewhere, it is shipped somewhere, it is unpacked by someone, it is sold across a counter to someone else. And in an investigation with so few stable points, even that modest chain felt worth following. Police tried to work backward through that chain with the tools they had. They checked where that style of box had been distributed. They looked into sales areas. They asked about stock patterns and likely customer neighborhoods. The hope was simple. If they could shrink the map even a little, they might also shrink the number of households worth asking about. But the box could only do so much. Retail records in the late 1950s were not built for future detective work. Cash sales left little behind. Store copies were temporary. Clerks remembered busy weeks. Not one plain carton carried out by one customer among many. So the investigation gained direction, but not resolution. The box suggested ordinary family life. It did not tell police whose family. That limitation shaped the canvas that followed. Officers and detectives began asking questions that sound almost domestic when you read them now. Who had recently bought nursery furniture? Who had a bassinet in the home? Who might have kept the box afterward, folded in a cellar, garage, closet, or corner room? Who reused cartons instead of throwing them away? These were not dramatic questions. They were patient ones. They belonged to the kind of investigation that depends on habits, not confessions. And habits are hard to track once time begins to pass. The blanket invited the same kind of thinking. It was examined not as a symbol, but as an object of use. What kind of blanket was it? How common was the material? Was it store-bought, homemade, mended, washed often, folded in a familiar way? Even when answers were limited, the act of asking mattered. It kept the inquiry close to the daily life the child must have lived before anyone outside that life knew he existed. That, in its own quiet way, was one of the saddest parts of the case. There were signs of routine. There were signs of handling. There were signs that this boy had passed through private rooms where adults noticed him enough to feed him, dress him, move him, wrap him. Yet when police looked outward for a name, those rooms seemed to vanish. So, the city was searched through smaller systems. Schools were asked to check attendance and unexplained absences. Churches were asked whether any family had quietly stopped bringing a child. Hospitals were contacted. Children's homes were contacted. Social service agencies were contacted. And because informal care was common in ways that were not always tidy on paper, detectives also looked into foster arrangements and private placements. That widened the file in a very particular way. Each institution had its own partial memory. A school might know a first name, a church might know only a family surname, or a pew, or an address that was already old. A welfare office might know there had been children in a household, but not where each child had gone afterward. No one record was enough. And so the case became an exercise in stitching together fragments that had never been designed to fit. You can feel the pace of that work if you imagine one detective carrying a photograph into office after office. He waits at a desk. He explains the case again. A clerk looks down at old entries. A supervisor is called in. Someone says the face is not familiar. Someone else says, perhaps there was a boy who came through briefly. Then a drawer opens. Then another. And after an hour, the answer is still maybe. Maybe was the language of this investigation. It filled the reports. Maybe he came from a home where records were poorly kept. Maybe he was moved from place to place. Maybe he was known by a nickname. Maybe he had been seen by neighbors who never learned his full name. Maybe the people who should have identified him were not willing to come forward. Each maybe forced another decision. Should detectives chase the possibility further? Should they hold it aside and compare it later? Should they send the photograph to another office? Should they return in a week and ask again? Cold cases are often imagined as single moments frozen in time, but in their early life, they are often made of these constant, small choices. One more call, one more visit, one more card in the index, one more side road checked because no other road looks better. The police response in Philadelphia reflected that kind of accumulation. The department did not abandon the case after the first publicity wave failed. If anything, the absence of a name made them more methodical. They circulated the child's likeness repeatedly. They used newspapers again. They used radio again. They handed out printed notices. They sent information to surrounding jurisdictions. Every new round of circulation carried the same hope, that someone who had hesitated before might now speak. And this produced one of the case's strangest features. The boy became widely seen without becoming known. His image reached many people. His identity reached no one with certainty. That gap is important. It helps explain why the case did not cool because of one missed clue alone. It cooled because the usual mechanisms of recognition kept failing in sequence. Publicity failed to produce a firm identification. Institutional canvassing failed to produce one. Retail tracing failed to produce one. And with each failure, the investigation had to move a little farther from direct knowledge and a little closer to inference. That is where the first real sense of coldness entered. Not neglect, not indifference, distance. Distance from the child's life. Distance from whoever last knew him. Distance created by paper systems that did not fully touch one another. As that distance grew, the police became more willing to consider children living at the margins of official notice. This was not a wild theory. It was a practical conclusion drawn from the absence itself. A regularly enrolled child, seen often in public, tied to school and doctor and relatives, was more likely to be recognized. A child outside those patterns was easier to lose. That possibility sent detectives into more difficult territory. They looked at orphanages and homes for children. They considered private adoptions that might not have been documented well. They looked at families who moved often. They looked at temporary caregivers. They looked at children who may have been called by pet names rather than legal names. Each of those categories made the search harder, not because police lacked interest, but because each removed the case one step farther from clean paperwork. And paperwork was what the error depended on. Fingerprints offered one route, though only a narrow one. The child's prints were taken and compared where possible. That sounds precise, and it was. But it also had limits. Fingerprint identification works best when there is something to compare against. A child who had never been printed in any official context would not emerge from that process with a name. So even careful science could only say what was not there, no ready match, no existing file that solved the matter. That negative result had a consequence. It reinforced the growing suspicion that the boy had lived without much formal contact with institutions that preserved identity. Police also used photographs with care. They brought them to agencies. They shared them across jurisdiction lines. They compared them against reports of missing children whose details were close, but not exact. A photo can stir memory in a different way than a written description. It can bypass a forgotten date and go straight to recognition. But recognition still depends on someone seeing the image and feeling certain enough to act. In this case, certainty remained scarce. There were many leads, there were not many solid ones. A proposed identity would surface. Detectives would compare the estimated age, appearance, dates, and known family circumstances. Then the fit would loosen. Sometimes the child in question was found alive. Sometimes the timing did not work. Sometimes dental or physical details pointed elsewhere. Each time a candidate was eliminated, the file became both narrower and more puzzling. That is another quiet truth of old investigations. Elimination is progress. But it can feel like loss when it leaves the central mystery untouched. And so the pages kept stacking up. Names that did not fit. Photographs that resembled him, then did not. Institutions that checked their books, then found nothing. Neighbors who thought they remembered a child, then could not settle on where or when. By the time these patterns had repeated enough, the case had changed character. It was no longer the immediate problem of identifying one unknown child after a fresh discovery. It was becoming a citywide riddle about absence itself. How could a child pass through a major city and leave so little trace that even broad publicity found no sure claimant? The answer, detectives began to suspect, was not a single hidden secret. It was a combination of ordinary blind spots. A child moved quietly between homes. A family avoided officials. A record was never made. A school absence was not pursued far. A church knew faces, but not legal names. A neighborhood noticed, but did not ask. And once those small blind spots overlap, a person can disappear from the formal world more completely than anyone expects. That idea was not comforting, but it was useful. It gave structure to the search. Instead of waiting only for a parent to identify the boy, investigators looked for indirect traces. Did any family have a child who seemed to stop appearing in public? Did any institution handle a boy whose trail ended abruptly? Did any local office record an address with children present, then later note none? This was slower than a direct identification would have been. Still, it was the only kind of progress left. Cause and effect kept pushing the inquiry outward. No firm family match led to broader institutional review. No institutional match led to deeper reliance on physical clues. No physical clue produced a household, so detectives expanded geographically. Philadelphia was searched, then nearby areas were checked more carefully. The site in Fox Chase might have been a disposal point and nothing more. If so, then the boy's real life had happened elsewhere. That possibility made every map larger. It also made every delay more costly. The longer it took to identify him, the less stable witness memory became. A clerk might forget a sale, a landlady might forget the dates a family stayed, a school aide might remember a face, but not a surname. A neighbor might feel unease about something seen months earlier, but by then the details would already be blurring. Time was not neutral in this case. It was active. It softened edges. It broke sequences. It turned witnesses from sources of detail into sources of mood and suggestion. That is one reason old detectives often lean so heavily on preserved objects. A box does not revise itself. A blanket does not second guess its own history. A cap does not grow uncertain under questioning. The objects stay the same. People do not. And in Philadelphia, the stable objects remained outnumbered by unstable memories. There were also practical pressures inside the department. A major city police force always has new cases arriving. Fresh crimes demand immediate labor. Missing people are reported. Robberies occur. Accidents fill the daily schedule. Against that current, an unidentified child case without a strong lead requires a different kind of commitment. Someone has to choose not to let it slide quietly downward in priority. In the Boy in the Box investigation, there were detectives who made that choice. They kept revisiting. They kept comparing. They kept the image in public circulation longer than many cases would have managed. That persistence is part of why the case endured so deeply in public memory. Not because the answers came quickly, but because the asking did not stop. Still, the pattern remained stubborn. Tips arrived, tips failed. Suggestions came from near and far. Many seemed plausible in the first retelling. Very few survived contact with the file. Some linked the boy to orphanages, others to foster homes, others to transient families passing through Philadelphia or leaving it. Some tips were built on resemblance alone. Others came from people who remembered overheard family stories or uneasy neighborhood rumors. All of them had to be handled with care. And care takes time. One lead might require checking church rosters, another might require locating an old hospital clerk, another might mean sending copies of the child's description to another city. You can see how a case becomes large without becoming clear. It gains mass, it does not gain shape. That difference is part of what makes cold cases so exhausting for the people who work them. There is movement, but little arrival. There is labor, but no clean reward. There is a desk full of evidence, and the central space at the center remains empty. Who was he? For investigators, that question sat underneath every practical step. Why examine the blanket? Because it might tell you about the home. Why trace the box? Because it might tell you about the home. And the home, in turn, might tell you the name. Everything kept circling back to identity. Without identity, motive could not be studied properly. Without identity, relationships could not be charted. Without identity, the case was permanently upstream from itself. That is why the next stage mattered so much. The police began to test proposed names one by one, even when the fit was weak. This produced a long procession of almosts. A child missing from another part of the city, a boy who had once lived in care, a youngster seen with adults who later disappeared from view, a family story about a child sent away, a report from outside Philadelphia that seemed close enough to merit comparison. Every almost had the same pattern. First, a burst of hope, then documents, then questions, then the slow narrowing that left it behind. If you read enough old case files, you begin to notice how much they depend on disciplined disappointment. Investigators cannot afford to fall in love with a lead. They have to test it. And testing often means letting go. This case demanded that again and again. There was no shortage of theories, there was a shortage of proof. Dental records where comparisons were possible helped eliminate some possibilities. That, too, is worth pausing over. Even in an era without modern databases, detectives tried to ground the work in objective comparisons. A claimed match had to do more than feel right. It had to survive contact with anatomy, timing, and documented fact. Often, it did not. And because the boy had no confident missing person report attached to him, the process was often backward. Instead of starting with a known child and checking whether it was him, police started with him and asked the world for candidate names. That reversal made the search much wider and much less efficient. It also made the public role unusually important. In some cases, police guard information tightly because they already know whom they are looking for. Here they needed recognition from outside. They needed the city to look into itself. That is why the photo mattered so much. That is why the flyers mattered so much. That is why, even after the first wave of attention passed, the case could not simply be folded away. But public attention has its own half-life. People care, then they move on. A new headline arrives, a new fear, a new event. The image that once covered front pages is clipped out and set aside. Eventually it yellows. Eventually it is found in a drawer by someone who says, "I remember that stage." But memory at that stage is no longer immediate. It is atmospheric. It remembers feeling before detail. The department had to fight that drift. They renewed appeals. They revisited inquiries. They made sure the image did not vanish completely. And yet the basic problem remained. No family stepped forward in a way that solved it. No institution confidently claimed him. No official record opened and said, "Here, he is here." That was the point at which the case began to teach investigators something harsher. Sometimes an unknown child is not unidentified because no one is looking. Sometimes he is unidentified because the world he moved through was private, unstable, or hidden in ways the public systems of the time were not prepared to penetrate. That conclusion made the investigation more serious, but also more fragile. If the boy had lived on the margins, then ordinary canvassing might never be enough. The very people most able to identify him might be the least likely to contact police. And if that was true, every week of silence became newly meaningful. Silence was no longer just absence, it was itself a clue, a difficult one, an unsettling one, but still a clue. Police had to ask what kind of life produces this degree of non-recognition. What kind of household leaves no advocate? What kind of social circumstance allows a child to be seen by some, known by few, and officially held by almost no one? The questions broadened beyond one crime. They touched poverty, they touched secrecy, they touched family instability, they touched the uneven ways society records children, especially those who are not protected by stable homes and predictable institutions. That is part of what made the case endure so strongly in Philadelphia. People sensed it was not only a mystery, it was also a mirror, a test of whether the city's systems could notice a vulnerable child before it was too late. In that sense, every failed lead had two consequences. It delayed identification, and it also exposed another weak point in the way information was kept. One office knew one fragment, another knew another, but no one place held the whole life. As months passed, those weaknesses became more visible. The file grew thick enough to show the pattern clearly. This was not one overlooked report waiting quietly in a drawer. If it had been, detectives likely would have found it. Instead, it was a case dispersed across too many incomplete possibilities. The boy might have been connected to a missing child report, filed under details that did not immediately match. Or he might never have been formally reported at all. He might have lived under a surname that changed. He might have moved through informal custody. He might have been hidden from public view for reasons that would never make it into a municipal ledger. Every possibility complicated the next, and so the child remained known largely by the manner of his discovery, not by his own name. That fact, more than anything else, shows how the case began to turn cold. A case cools when its language stops advancing, when instead of new facts, it circles around the same description. The boy, the box, the blanket, the road, the woods, the photograph. Those became the fixed points. Everything else kept sliding. By the end of the first sustained period of canvassing, detectives had done what the period reasonably allowed. They had searched through public recognition, they had searched through commercial tracing, they had searched through local institutions, they had pursued dozens upon dozens of suggestions, and the result was not nothing. It was a clearer understanding of the problem. The child was hard to identify because he had likely lived in places where identity itself was weakly documented, weakly shared, or actively concealed. That recognition did not solve the case, but it changed how the next phase would unfold. The investigation would depend less on one dramatic breakthrough and more on patient comparison over time. That is a different kind of policing. Less sprint, more vigil. The city, meanwhile, went on living around the mystery. Cars moved along Susquehanna Road. Neighborhoods changed in small ways. Clerks left stores and took other jobs. Families moved from one block to another. Children who had been young when the case first appeared in the paper grew older and remembered only that there had once been a boy nobody could name. The case was still active, but it was already becoming historical. That shift matters because history changes the quality of evidence. A fresh memory becomes a recollection. A recollection becomes a story. A story becomes something repeated within families and communities, sometimes faithfully, sometimes not. Investigators knew this. It is why they kept returning to records and physical objects. They needed anchors. Without anchors, the case would drift entirely into rumor. And there were plenty of rumors. A child from a home, a child from an institution, a child from a family that had left the city. What mattered to detectives was not which rumor sounded most vivid, but which one could survive a careful check. So they began sorting proposed identities into piles of increasing doubt. Some names arrived with addresses, some came with only a neighborhood, some came with nothing more than a first name or the memory of a boy seen at a window. That sorting was a form of discipline. It kept the case from dissolving into every sad possibility the city could imagine. If a lead named a missing child, police asked when the child had last been seen. If a tip involved an institution, detectives asked for rosters, intake notes, transfer slips, and discharge papers. If someone suggested a family had quietly lost a child, officers looked for rent records, school attendance, baptismal traces, or any small document that could hold still long enough to be compared. Again and again, the process narrowed. Again and again, the proposed names slipped away. A child from one county was found to be alive. Another had dental details that did not align. Another was older than first believed. Another had been accounted for after the first burst of confusion settled. Each elimination mattered. Each one also made the true answer seem farther from ordinary explanation. By then, the case had entered the stage where a detective's memory became almost as important as the file itself. Someone had to remember which lead had already been checked. Someone had to remember which family story had been pursued under a slightly different spelling. Someone had to remember that a photograph sent from another jurisdiction had once seemed promising and had then been set aside for a reason hidden 3 reports deep. Paperwork can preserve facts. It does not always preserve the shape of the search. That shape lived partly in the minds of the men working it, and as the calendar moved forward, that human memory became both a strength and a vulnerability. A detective who stayed with the case could see patterns in the stack. A detective reassigned or retired took some of that map away with him. That is one of the quiet reasons old cases cool. Not because the pages vanish, but because lived familiarity with those pages begins to thin. In the early 1960s, that cooling became more visible. The first wave of public attention had long since passed. The city still remembered the child, but memory had settled into a lower register. The image was familiar, the answer was not. Active leads had slowed, newspaper space moved on to fresher events. Inside the department, the case remained open, but its pace changed. There were no longer constant new directions to chase each week. Instead, There were periodic reviews. A detective would return to the file. A comparison would be made. A bulletin might be recirculated. A possibility from another city would be checked. Then the file would wait again. That waiting can look like inaction from the outside. In cold case work, it often means something else. It means the known evidence has been carried as far as present tools can take it. The work then becomes preservation. Not exciting preservation, not dramatic, just the patient effort to keep a case intact for a future that might understand it better. That is what happened here. The unknown boy was not forgotten and then suddenly rediscovered. He was remembered in intervals, remembered by detectives, remembered by newspaper archives, remembered by the city cemetery where he was buried under the name the world knew him by, not the name he had been born with. That burial marked a painful midpoint. Without a family identification, the child was laid to rest under a placeholder identity. The phrase itself carried the coldness of the case. Not a true name, not a solved life. Just a description that acknowledged how he had been found and how little the city could yet say. There is something especially hard about that stage in an investigation. A burial can offer dignity. It can also underline uncertainty. The child was no longer waiting in an evidence room for immediate recognition. He had entered remembrance without resolution, and that changed the emotional logic of the case. At first, investigators had been trying to recover a missing identity quickly. Now they were trying to keep faith with an unanswered one over years. That is a different burden. It depends on routine. Files are indexed, photographs are stored, personal effects are preserved, correspondence is retained. The goal is no longer only to solve the case tomorrow, it is to make sure the case can still be solved at all, someday. Because detectives understood that the original evidence received a kind of long-term care. The photographs remained important. So did notes about the clothing and nearby items. So did every comparison already made, because future investigators would need to know not only what had been found, but what had been ruled out. An old investigation can be lost in two ways. It can lose the evidence, or it can lose the memory of what the evidence has already been asked to do. Philadelphia tried to avoid both losses. The case file, in that sense, became an archive of perseverance. Each review told the same story in a slightly newer context. Check recent missing children again. Compare with newly reported absences from another jurisdiction. Review institutional records where possible. See whether a name rejected earlier should be reconsidered under updated age estimates or corrected details. These were modest acts. Together they kept the case alive. They also exposed the same central obstacle every time. If no one had made a clear report when the child disappeared from daily life, then the police were always searching in a landscape of incomplete comparisons. And incompleteness has a strange power. It allows many theories to exist at once. It also prevents any one theory from taking root securely. As the case settled into cold file status, silence itself began to feel evidential. Not conclusive, but meaningful. Investigators had to consider what it meant that no parent, aunt, uncle, neighbor, teacher, or doctor had stepped forward with certainty even after years of publicity. One explanation was fear, another was shame, another was deliberate concealment within a private household world. Another was that the people who might have recognized him had themselves disappeared, died, moved away, or never connected the public image to the child they knew. And there was the hardest possibility of all, that the systems which should have created obvious trails around his life had simply never done so in a usable way. This is where the phrase cold case can be misleading. It sounds final. In reality, many cold cases are full of low, steady movement. A detective hears from another state, a journalist republishes the image, an archivist locates an old list. A missing child report from years before is pulled and compared one more time. Nothing changes quickly. Still, things continue. That was true here. The case moved through the 1960s and beyond as a recurring act of attention. From time to time, investigators refreshed the inquiry. The tools were still limited, but they were not absent. Fingerprints could be revisited if new files emerged elsewhere. Dental comparisons could still eliminate proposed matches. Photographs could be shown again. Correspondence could be sent to agencies handling children, family welfare, and interstate information. If the city could not solve the mystery through memory alone, then perhaps one delayed document would surface, one corrected report, one relative years later willing to speak. That hope never entirely left the file. It simply became quieter. You can imagine the practical scene. A metal cabinet, a folder thicker than most routine cases, old newspaper clippings tucked beside police memoranda, a detective opening it on a slow afternoon between newer assignments. He scans a page and recognizes familiar names that did not fit. He pauses at the child's photograph. He checks whether a newly reported missing person from another place could possibly align. He writes a note. He sends an inquiry. Then he waits. The rhythm is almost monastic. Question, comparison, silence, return. That rhythm shapes many cases that survive across decades. It shaped this one too. Public memory helped sustain it. Philadelphia did not stop caring. The boy's grave was visited. His story remained part of local conversation. Newspapers returned to it from time to time, especially when anniversaries approached, or when some new theory appeared to deserve notice. These returns mattered for a simple reason. An unidentified child case needs witnesses from outside the file. It needs the public to keep looking inward. It needs old readers to become older witnesses. Sometimes a person in middle age remembers something they did not understand when they were young. Sometimes a family secret changes hands after a funeral. Sometimes the people who were silent in one decade are less silent in another. Cold case work often depends on those slow human changes. But human changes carry distortion too. A story told after 20 years is not the same as a story told after 2 weeks. By the time later witnesses began to emerge with more elaborate accounts, detectives had to balance openness with skepticism. Memory can sharpen around one detail and fail completely around another. It can preserve a room, or a smell, or a phrase while misplacing the year. It can mix family rumor with personal observation until the witness no longer knows which part came firsthand. That problem became central in later decades of the boy in the box case. Several theories rose above the level of casual rumor because they carried intimate seeming details. One person might say a child had been kept in isolation. Another might describe a household with unusual secrecy. Another might remember a ride, or a meal, or a location that felt too specific to ignore. Investigators could not simply dismiss such claims. They also could not accept them because they felt moving. So the file entered another long phase. One witness at a time, one theory at a time, each tested against the old evidence. One of the most discussed later witness accounts came from a woman often identified publicly only by an initial. Her account did not emerge in the first days or first years. It surfaced much later, and because it arrived late, it carried both promise and difficulty. She described a childhood environment in which she believed the unknown boy had been present. Her story included domestic details that seemed, at least in part, to line up with the old case file. For investigators and researchers, that made it impossible to ignore. If a witness offers a broad theory, it may not go far. If a witness offers a lived setting, specific household habits, and details that appear to touch the evidence, the lead becomes heavier. Still, heaviness is not proof. Police had to ask careful questions. Could the witness place the time accurately? Could the people in the account be verified? Did addresses match known geography? Did any physical details line up independently without relying on the witness's own memory? Were there records showing the household existed as described? And perhaps most important, did the story contain details that were truly unknown to the public, or only details that a person might have absorbed indirectly from years of local coverage? Those are slow questions. Cold cases require them because sincerity is not enough. A witness can be sincere and mistaken. A witness can also be partly right in ways that still fail to identify the person involved. That ambiguity became part of the boy in the box file for a long time. Some later accounts contained elements that investigators found interesting. Some even seemed unusually intimate. Yet, when tested against records, maps, and timelines, they often lost strength. An address would not align. A date would drift. A claimed household event would remain unsupported by any document outside the memory itself. That did not always mean the witness was inventing the story. It often meant the delay had imposed a fog that evidence could not entirely clear. The cost of delayed testimony is not only that facts fade, it is that possible truths become harder to separate from reshaped memory. Investigators were patient with this. They had to be. A cold case does not offer the luxury of perfect witnesses on demand. If testimony appears after decades, it may be the only living route into rooms no record ever captured. So detectives and later researchers listened, they compared, they revisited. They asked whether even an imperfect story might redirect the archival search. Could a remembered street send them to the right parish records? Could a household rumor narrow which neighborhoods to examine? Could a witness's mention of a purchase, a vehicle, or a burial detail open some forgotten administrative path? This is one of the least glamorous parts of old investigations. People tend to imagine breakthroughs as single moments. In reality, many breakthroughs begin as small permissions. A theory is not proven, but it gives detectives permission to check a new set of records. A witness is not fully reliable, but enough details are stable that investigators are permitted to take another look at the geography. That sort of qualified attention kept the case moving. Even when a major theory failed to become proof, it could still teach the file something. For example, later witness statements pushed investigators to think more closely about the possibility that the child had lived in a highly private domestic world, not merely undocumented, but actively shielded. That possibility fit the earlier silence in a troubling way. If the boy had not been regularly visible in school, church, or neighborhood life, then the original canvases would have had little to catch. The box and blanket might still point to household life, but that life could have existed mostly behind doors. This did not solve the case. It did explain why ordinary recognition might have failed so completely. There is a difference between a child who is unnoticed and a child who is intentionally unshared with the world. The case may have brushed against that difference from the beginning without being able to define it. Years later, witnesses and theories gave that intuition more structure, even when they could not turn it into prosecutable certainty. Another important feature of the later phase was the role of independent researchers and journalists. When official investigations endure for decades, other people begin carrying parts of the memory. Reporters revisit old files, writers examine archived clippings, citizen researchers collect timelines and maps. Sometimes they muddy the waters. Sometimes they preserve details that might otherwise sink. In this case, public fascination did both. It kept the boy present in local memory. It also produced new speculation, some careful and some not. Police had to navigate that. Every widely discussed theory risked reshaping witness memory. Once an idea enters newspapers or television, later witnesses may unconsciously adjust their own recollections toward it. That is another reason detectives moved slowly with high-profile claims. A lead exposed to public repetition changes texture. It stops being purely evidentiary and starts becoming cultural. Then the case must be handled with even more patience. One sees this especially in the long life of the witness theory tied to family abuse and concealment. It was compelling to many people because it provided what the case had always lacked, a private world that could account for the public's silence. But compelling is not the same as confirmed. Investigators examined whether details from that theory matched the original route into Fox Chase, the known handling of the child, and the preserved physical evidence. Some points seemed suggestive. Others resisted. In the end, the theory remained important without becoming definitive. And that distinction is worth keeping. A cold case often contains ideas that matter because they help frame the right questions, even if they do not answer them outright. The later witness phase also highlighted the burden of old record systems. By the time these theories surfaced, some documents had been lost, some officials were dead, some institutions had reorganized or closed. Addresses had changed, businesses had disappeared, neighborhoods looked different. Even when detectives wanted to verify something simple, the infrastructure around the old event might no longer exist. This is one of time's quiet cruelties in investigation. It does not only blur memory, it erases the places memory would have been checked. A parish merges with another. A welfare office destroys old files according to policy. A hospital changes ownership. A store chain no longer has the records of one season's sales from the 1950s. In each of those erasures, a possible answer thins. And so the case remained open in two senses at once. Emotionally, it felt close. People knew the photograph, they knew the grave, they knew the phrase attached to the mystery. Evidentially, it was trapped. The story was vivid, but the proof was fragmentary. Many cold cases live in that tension. This one lived there for decades. Yet something important was changing underneath it all. The investigators who preserved the file had made one decision right from the beginning that would later matter more than they could possibly have known. They kept the evidence. They kept enough of it, and carefully enough that the case could someday be asked new questions. That is not a minor fact. In the mid-century years, no one could foresee the exact shape of future forensic science. But careful preservation meant the future would at least have something to work with. The old photographs would still exist. The physical remains, though buried, could potentially be revisited. The original notes, however imperfect, would still give later experts a map back to the first observations. That is what allowed the next era of the investigation to emerge. Not suddenly, not with dramatic music and bright headlines at first, more like a second dawn arriving over paper. Advances in forensic science changed many long unsolved cases in the late 20th century and early 21st. Techniques that once seemed impossible became routine. DNA could identify family relationships from small biological traces. Digital databases could compare records across distance. Facial reconstruction could be updated and shared widely online. And most important for unidentified victims, genealogical methods could move backward from a person with no name toward relatives who did not even know they were connected to the case. For the boy in the box investigation, this new scientific world did not erase the old one. It built on it. Every preserved decision from the 1950s now mattered more. Because the evidence had been retained, the file could be reopened not as a symbolic act, but as a practical one. The child could be re-examined with tools the original detectives never had. That shift began gradually. There were renewed forensic efforts over time, and among them were exhumations and updated examinations of the remains. Such decisions are never casual. They require legal process, technical care, and a belief that new methods justify disturbing a burial made decades earlier. In this case, that belief was strong. The city had carried the mystery long enough to know that traditional routes were exhausted. If science now offered a way to recover identity through biology rather than recognition, then the old restraint had to give way to a new form of hope. Exhumation in an old case is a quiet kind of faith. It says the person is still worth asking for. It says the unanswered file is not merely historic, it is active. And so the remains were revisited for modern testing. That testing did not immediately produce a neat answer. People sometimes imagine DNA as instant certainty. In reality, especially in old cases, the process can be slow and technically difficult. Samples must be recovered in usable condition. Profiles must be generated. Comparisons must be made. If no direct match exists in law enforcement databases, the search may have to proceed through more distant relatives. That means building outward through family trees. And family trees, especially in older urban communities, can be dense, incomplete, and full of changed names, remarriages, adoptions, and private histories. Still, modern forensics gave the case something it had never truly possessed before: a path that did not depend on somebody recognizing the child's face from memory. For decades, the search had asked the public, "Do you know him?" Now science could ask a different question. Who is biologically connected to him, even if they never knew he existed? That reversal changed everything. It moved the case away from silence in a private household and toward kinship in the wider world. A relative might not know the child, a relative might not know the circumstances, but a relative's DNA could still point investigators toward the family line from which the child came. Genealogical investigation is methodical in a way that would have felt familiar to the original detectives. It is not magic. It is paperwork, comparison, and patience, only on a different scale. Researchers assemble matches. They study census records, birth records, marriage records, obituaries, city directories, and other documents that reveal how families branch and move. They build possible trees, then they trim them. They compare dates, they compare ages, they compare known relatives against what the lab can support, and they move forward only when each branch holds. That pace is slow, but it is honest. A family tree in a cold case is not a story first. It is a structure of checked relationships. One birth leads to parents. Those parents lead to siblings. The siblings lead to cousins. Then the map grows wider and at the same time more precise. In the boy in the box case, this new method did what decades of public circulation could not. It began to point inward, toward one family line, then another, until the shape of the child's origins became less abstract. That did not mean the old mystery vanished. It meant one part of it was finally becoming measurable. For years, the central problem had been a lack of entry. No one knew where to start. Now investigators had something they had never possessed before: biological direction. That direction led them into records that were not glamorous, but deeply important. Birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, cemetery records, addresses, family groupings, the ordinary paperwork of a life, or rather, of many lives connected around one child. As genealogical work advanced, investigators began to narrow toward a conclusion that had once seemed almost unreachable. The boy had belonged to a real family already present in the historical record. He had not drifted out of nowhere. He had not existed only as a photograph in a file. He had parents. He had relatives. He had a legal identity that had somehow remained hidden from the investigation for decades. That fact alone tells you something about why the case went cold. The answer had existed, but the systems needed to reach it had not yet been joined. The records were there in pieces. The science was not. The connections could be made eventually. They simply could not be made in 1957. As the family reconstruction grew firmer, police had to move carefully. A name in a cold case carries weight beyond the file. Once announced, it changes public memory forever. So before any disclosure, the work had to be tested again and again. Was the genealogical pathway sound? Did the biological evidence support it? Did the timeline of birth align? Could other records independently confirm what the DNA suggested? This was the opposite of a rushed reveal. It was the patient checking of a bridge before anyone stepped onto it. Then, after all those years, the bridge held. In the autumn of 2022, Philadelphia officials announced that the child, long known publicly only by the name given to the mystery, had been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The announcement was historic, but the tone around it was strikingly restrained. There was relief. There was emotion. There was also caution, because identification answered the oldest question in the case, but not the only one. Still, the importance of that moment is difficult to overstate. For more than 6 decades, the city had tried to return a name to a child. Now, through preserved evidence and modern genealogy, it had done so. The consequence was immediate. Everything in the file had to be reconsidered under the light of this new fact. A boy with no identity had become a boy with a family. That reframed the entire case. The question was no longer simply why nobody recognized him. The question became how. Despite having a documented birth and a biological family, he could remain unnamed for so long. That is where the story grows even more thoughtful. Because once the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli entered the public record, the coldness of the case looked less like one mystery and more like a chain of smaller failures. Not dramatic failures, ordinary ones. Records not connected across decades. Family circumstances not visible to public institutions. Early investigators limited by the tools of their era. Children not always tracked with the consistency we now assume. And perhaps, somewhere behind all that, private decisions inside a family world that the public never fully saw. Philadelphia police shared only part of what they had learned about Joseph's background. That restraint was deliberate. There were living relatives, there were privacy concerns, and there was an active investigation into the circumstances around his death, which remained unresolved. But even the limited information released was enough to shift the shape of public understanding. Joseph had been born in January of 1953. That meant he was 4 years old when he was found in February of 1957. That estimate aligned closely with what the original investigators had believed. It was one of those quiet moments in old cases where you can feel respect for the first detectives. They had worked carefully. They had not lacked effort. They had lacked reach. The name also placed Joseph within a specific branch of Philadelphia family history. His surname tied him to relatives who could now be studied through records in a way the old file never permitted. That did not mean public certainty about every household detail, but it did mean the child could be located in the world differently. He was no longer only an unknown figure at the edge of Fox Chase. He had entered the ordinary grammar of life, born, named, connected, remembered. That change mattered emotionally, but it also mattered analytically. Once investigators knew who Joseph was, they could revisit older theories with a sharper standard. Did any of the long-discussed witness accounts fit his family reality? Did any addresses line up better now? Did any claims about parentage or domestic circumstances collapse under the new information? A solved identity allows a cold case to sort its own history. Some theories gain weight, others lose it. In Joseph's case, the public learned that he had not been adopted. That detail mattered because many older theories had leaned toward orphanages, private placements, or informal custody beyond birth family lines. With his identification, the investigation could begin separating what had once seemed plausible from what was now less likely. At the same time, police made clear that not all of Joseph's life had yet been reconstructed publicly. There were years still to understand, relationships still to examine, movements still to chart. This is often what happens after a major identification. The public thinks the case has ended. In reality, the case changes shape. Identity is a doorway. Beyond it is context, and context can be just as difficult as the name itself. Investigators now had to ask where Joseph had lived, who had regular care of him, who was responsible for him in the weeks and months before he was found, who knew enough to report him missing and did not, and why. That last question matters because naming Joseph did not erase the long silence that followed his disappearance from daily life. If anything, the silence became more pointed. He was not a child with no family line. He was a child whose family line had somehow not surfaced in a way that helped police in 1957. How does that happen? Part of the answer lies in the era itself. Mid-century record keeping was fragmented. Birth records were not instantly searchable. Family structures were less transparent to institutions. Communication between agencies was slow. If relatives lived apart, or if a child did not move through school and medical systems in a regular pattern, the trail could go dim quickly. But part of the answer may also lie in social secrecy. Families, then as now, could keep difficult truths inside the home. Children could be hidden from broader community life. Households under strain could become private in ways that no police canvas would easily penetrate. And once enough time passed, even family members outside the immediate household might not know what had happened. That possibility had hovered over the case for decades. Joseph's identification did not prove every version of it, but it made the question more serious because now there was a real child in a real family network whose absence had not triggered the kind of public recognition the investigation depended on. The coldness of the case was no longer abstract. It had become historical and structural at once. Investigators also had to revisit the practical details of the original scene through this new lens. The blanket, the cap, the bassinet box, those things still mattered. Only now they could be considered in relation to a named child rather than an unknown one. Did they suggest the sort of home Joseph likely came from? Did they fit a family with limited means, with reused household items, with ordinary domestic objects kept longer than intended? The box, especially, took on a different quality. For years, it had been one of the few clues that linked the child to a home life. Now it became part of a more focused question. Whose home life? And had that home life included signs of privacy, instability, or concealment that would explain why canvases found so little? The public announcement in 2022 also brought renewed attention to the cemetery and to the language that had surrounded the case for more than 60 years. People had long visited the grave of the child under the placeholder name. Now they could speak to him differently, that mattered in ways that are hard to reduce to evidence. A name restores proportion. It lets a person be more than the circumstance in which the world encountered them. Joseph Augustus Zarelli was not only a case file. He was a boy who had once been carried into rooms, called by name, held in somebody's memory, even if those memories never reached police in time. That shift in language affected the investigators too. Cold case work can become technical by necessity, but identification returns a human center to the work. Officers and genealogists had not merely solved a puzzle, they had corrected a historical absence, and that correction threw the rest of the mystery into sharper relief. Because if Joseph had a name, then someone had once known it. If someone had once known it, then there had been a period when the answer sat close to ordinary life. Not in a laboratory, not in a genealogy chart, but in a kitchen, a family conversation, an address book, a baptismal memory, a relative's uneasy silence, and somehow that ordinary knowledge had not become official knowledge. That is one of the clearest answers to the question in the video's title. Why did the case go cold? Because the information that could have named him lived in compartments that never met. Private family knowledge stayed private. Public systems remained partial. Investigators worked from the outside inward, while the truth sat somewhere inside a world they could not access. Only decades later did science create a route around those walls. Even then, identification did not produce a neat ending. Police emphasized that Joseph's death remained unsolved. The naming of the child was a milestone, not closure. This distinction matters, and it is worth moving through slowly. There are really two cases here. The first was the search for identity. The second was the search for explanation. For decades, the first case blocked the second. Without a name, detectives could not properly reconstruct his movements or relationships. Now they could begin. But beginning is not the same as finishing. Once Joseph was identified, investigators turned to family history with renewed care, not to expose private pain casually, but to understand sequence. Who were his parents? Where were they living? What was the structure of the household around him? Were there siblings? Were there relatives nearby? Did anyone outside the immediate home know enough to account for him in early 1957? These are delicate questions in any case. They become even more delicate when many of the central adults are no longer alive. Time had solved one problem by giving science room to mature. It had worsened another by taking witnesses with it. Some of Joseph's close relatives had died before the public identification was announced. That meant the case had to proceed through records, surviving kin, and whatever fragments remained. Again, you can feel how time acts in both directions. It preserves old evidence if someone cares for it. It also closes mouths forever. Investigators released some details about Joseph's parentage. He was born to parents who had not been married to each other. That fact in itself should not be over dramatized. But in the social world of the 1950s, family structures outside conventional public presentation could carry secrecy, strain, and uneven record visibility. It could affect where a child lived, who claimed responsibility, and who spoke openly about him. So even this limited genealogical fact opened broader questions. Had Joseph lived with one parent? Both? Other relatives? Had he been kept partly outside ordinary social circulation? Had some adults in his family line known of him while others knew little or nothing? These are not side questions. They sit at the center of why recognition failed. The old investigation had depended on the assumption that someone somewhere would see the child's picture and know. Joseph's identification suggests that assumption may have been too simple. Knowing a child exists is not the same as being in a position to identify him publicly. In complicated families, information is often uneven. One branch knows one history, another branch knows very little. A child may be familiar inside one household and nearly invisible outside it. And if the adults closest to that child remain silent, the broader family may never build the full picture. That possibility sits heavily over the post-identification phase. Police also indicated that Joseph had relatives on both maternal and paternal sides who had to be located and assessed through the genealogical process. That means his family history, while ultimately solvable, was not obvious on the surface. It had to be assembled. That alone reinforces how difficult the case would have been in the original era. If 21st century genealogists needed biological testing and extensive family tree work to connect him firmly, then 1957 detectives, working with paper circulars and hand-delivered photos, were confronting an almost impossible maze. This is not to excuse every institutional gap. It is simply to understand the scale of the challenge. The old investigators did not fail because they ignored the case. They failed because the tools that could unite the scattered pieces did not yet exist. As the public absorbed Joseph's name, journalists and researchers returned to older theories with fresh curiosity. One of the most immediate questions was whether the late witness stories that had shaped public imagination for years were now strengthened or weakened. In some cases, the answer seemed to be weakened. Claims that depended on adoption or a wholly unrelated household fit less cleanly after the identification. In other cases, the broader idea of a private, hidden domestic world still felt relevant, even if specific witness details could not be confirmed. That is, a common outcome in old mysteries. A theory may be wrong in its particulars, but right in its general intuition. The public often wants a witness account either canonized or discarded. Real investigations are more measured. They ask what remains useful. If an old theory suggested the child was hidden from wider view, and the eventual identification points toward family complexity and social invisibility, then the theory may still have diagnostic value without being literally true in every detail. That kind of sorting is part of mature cold case work. Not all old leads are winners or losers. Some are stepping stones. Some are echoes of the truth, heard from too far away. The post-identification investigation also reanimated the geography of Philadelphia in a different way. Fox Chase remained the place where the city encountered Joseph, but attention now turned more seriously to where he had lived before that. Records could be searched with purpose. Family addresses could be plotted. Movements could be narrowed. Instead of asking the entire region whether any child was missing, police could examine a named child's likely path through the city and its surrounding neighborhoods. This was progress of a very specific kind, not dramatic. Grounding. At last, the map belonged to someone. That grounding likely allowed investigators to revisit old administrative blind spots with greater clarity. Had there been school records? If not, why not? Had there been medical records? If so, under what address or guardian? Were there welfare interactions involving the family? Did census material, city directories, or later family documentation reveal separation between branches that might explain decades of silence? These questions are harder than the public often realizes. A child can have a legal identity and still leave very little day-to-day institutional paper, especially in the 1950s, especially in situations where family life was unstable, hidden, or informal. That, again, is part of why the case went cold. People often imagine cold cases as the result of one overlooked clue. Here, the deeper cause appears more layered. A child with a real name, a family with internal complexity, a period in which private family realities could remain largely sealed off from municipal systems, and investigators forced to search from the wrong side of the wall. When police announced Joseph's name, they also noted that they were not naming potential suspects or describing final conclusions about what happened around him. That restraint left many people frustrated. But it was also honest. An identification created new responsibilities. It did not create instant proof for every remaining question. Who last had care of him? Why no one reported him missing in a way that helped? Why he was left where he was found? Those questions still required evidence, not assumption. And evidence in a decades-old case must be handled with unusual care. Once the name was public, there was a risk that the world would begin writing its own complete story too quickly. Families would be speculated about, witness accounts would be force-fitted, ordinary gaps in records would be treated as sinister with too much confidence. Police had to resist that pressure. A patient investigation remains patient even after the cameras arrive. So the case entered another phase of measured review. Now investigators could compare every old note against Joseph's newly known family framework. A lead from the 1950s that once seemed random might now have a place. A witness account from the 1990s might now be checked against real kinship ties. An old address could now be tested against the family tree, rather than floating as a detached rumor. This is one of the great gifts of identification in an unknown child case. It does not merely answer one question, it reorganizes every prior question beneath it. The old file can finally be read in the right order. And yet, even with that advantage, not every answer arrives. Some witnesses are gone, some records are gone, some actions were never documented. Some family silences survive the people who created them. This is why the aftermath of Joseph's identification feels both hopeful and unfinished. The city succeeded in returning his name. It did not recover all the missing speech around his life. There is another reason the case remains so difficult, even after modern science intervened. Genealogy tells you who a person is connected to. It does not tell you motive. It does not explain household choices. It can point toward a family, but not necessarily toward the exact private history inside that family. That still requires interviews, records, corroboration, and time. In Joseph's case, the modern tools solved identity by bypassing silence. But the deeper story still had to move through silence itself. That is slower work. Police and prosecutors also had to consider what justice could realistically look like after so many decades. If principal figures were dead, criminal accountability might be impossible in the conventional sense, but factual accountability still mattered. Naming the adults responsible for care, understanding whether concealment had occurred, determining whether any institutional failures could be identified in hindsight. These things matter even when a courtroom is no longer likely. Cold cases are not only about charges, they are also about truth and about historical correction. Joseph's name made that correction possible. Still, the emotional center of the case shifted in a notable way after 2022. For decades, the public had held a kind of protective grief for an unknown child. After the identification, that grief became more personal. People spoke his name. They visited the cemetery differently. Media coverage, at its best, began referring to him as Joseph rather than by the old label alone. That change may seem small. It is not. Language shapes memory. A placeholder name keeps a person inside mystery. A real name lets them step partly outside it. And with Joseph, that mattered because the old label had always carried the coldness of the case in it. He had been known by an absence. Now he could be remembered by a life. That rehumanization is not separate from investigation. It often strengthens it. When a case involves a named child rather than an emblem of mystery, public discourse can become more disciplined. The question is no longer only what happened in the abstract, it becomes what happened to Joseph in the specific, and who in his world knew enough to prevent his erasure. That shift also forces a harder review of the original coldness itself. It asks whether the case went cold because the city stopped looking, or because the search kept pressing against doors that records could not open. In Joseph's case, the second explanation seems closer to the truth. The original detectives were not waiting idly for fortune. They were moving through the systems available to them. They checked schools, they checked hospitals, they checked agencies, institutions, neighbors, and reports from other jurisdictions. But if Joseph's daily life had not passed through those systems in a regular way, then the investigation was always going to arrive late. And late is often where cold cases begin. Not only late in time, but late in access. By the time police are asking, the people who know may already be silent. By the time a file reaches the right desk, a witness may have moved. By the time a photograph is circulated, the child may have been absent long enough that routines have already adjusted around that absence. That is one reason the identification of Joseph Augustus Sorelli feels so important and so incomplete at once. It confirmed that the answer had always existed inside history. It did not mean history had preserved all the surrounding explanation. There were still missing rooms in the house of the story. Still, a name changes what investigators can responsibly say. Before identification, many ideas about the case were broad. After identification, some of them became testable. Police could examine the timelines of Joseph's parents. They could look at addresses linked to each side of the family. They could ask whether certain relatives likely knew of him, knew about him only in passing, or may have had no regular contact at all. Each of those distinctions matters. A family is not a single witness. It is a network, and networks distribute knowledge unevenly. Another branch may know there was once a child, but not where he lived. A cousin may remember hearing a name and nothing more. A grandparent may have partial facts. A half-sibling may know stories told years later after memory has already changed shape. That kind of fragmentation is ordinary in family life. In an unidentified child case, it can be devastating. Because police in the 1950s depended on a clear line of recognition. Someone would see the image. Someone would step forward. Someone would say, "That is our boy." But if no single person felt able, willing, or informed enough to make that statement confidently, the whole mechanism stalled. That appears to be a large part of what happened here. Joseph had biological relatives, yet his existence as a publicly identifiable child may have been much narrower than his family tree suggests. That is a painful difference. It also helps explain why naming him did not suddenly produce a complete social biography. Investigators still had to sort through which relatives had real knowledge of his early life and which did not. This is where the patient side of cold case work shows itself most clearly. A modern announcement can look like the end of a mystery. Inside the file, it often marks the start of a more delicate phase. Now detectives are no longer searching a city at random. They are narrowing in on people with actual proximity. That can sharpen the questions, but it can also make every answer more emotionally charged. A vague theory hurts no one in particular. A real family history does. So police moved carefully. They released Joseph's name. They confirmed his date of birth. They made plain that the investigation into his death remained active. But they did not flood the public with every private detail they had learned. That caution was not evasion. It reflected both evidentiary and human limits. There may have been surviving relatives who were not responsible for what happened and who had themselves only recently learned how they were connected. There may have been uncertain recollections that did not merit public repetition. And there may have been lines of inquiry still best pursued quietly. That measured tone is worth dwelling on. For decades, the case had attracted public fascination partly because of the strangeness of its central gap. An unidentified child in a major city, unclaimed despite broad publicity, feels almost impossible. Once Joseph was named, that fascination could easily have tilted into accusation before the facts were ready. Investigators resisted that. They kept the center of the case where it belonged, on Joseph, on his identity, on the systems and silences that delayed that identity for so long, on the still unanswered question of how his life became hidden enough to evade recognition. There is another practical consequence of identification that often goes unnoticed. It allows the burial, the grave, and the public memory around them to become more precise. For many years, the cemetery visit was an act of care toward an unknown child. That care was genuine. People brought toys. People left flowers. People treated the grave as a place of witness when the file could offer little else. After Joseph was identified, those gestures changed slightly in meaning. They were no longer only symbolic. They were directed toward a named person in the historical record. That change does not solve anything, but it corrects something. And correction matters in old cases because they are built out of so many accumulated inaccuracies and absences. Even a small act of factual repair has weight. In this case, the repair was not small. It restored a boy to his own name after more than 60 years. And yet the larger title question remains stubborn. Why did the boy in the box case go cold? Not why was it eventually solved in part. Why did it go cold? Once Joseph's name entered the file, the answer became less mysterious and more structural. It went cold because the initial search depended on systems of visibility that may never have touched his actual life. It went cold because missing person reporting in that era was local, inconsistent, and deeply dependent on adults who chose to use it. It went cold because a child can have a birth certificate and still leave very little accessible record of daily living. It went cold because family information is not automatically public information. And it went cold because each year that passed reduced the power of witness memory while increasing the force of rumor. You can trace that cause and effect almost chapter by chapter. First, there was the discovery, then there was the broad public appeal. Then came the canvass through stores, institutions, and neighborhoods. Then the waves of almost matches. Then the burial under a placeholder identity. Then the long era of periodic reviews, witness theories, and public remembrance without proof. Finally, there was the return of science. At no point does the file suggest that one obvious lead was ignored, and everything would have been different if one clerk had simply looked in the right drawer. The case is more troubling than that. It suggests a world in which a vulnerable child could occupy a very narrow circle of recognition, then vanish from that circle without the larger systems around him responding clearly enough. That has implications beyond Joseph. It tells us something about the era. It tells us something about how institutions once saw children unevenly. And it tells us something about how cold cases are often made from the overlap of small limitations, not one dramatic collapse. When you think of the 1950s, it is easy to imagine a city with strong neighborhood knowledge, where everyone knew everyone else, where a missing child would instantly become communal concern. Sometimes that was true. But cities also contain private worlds. Families fracture, people move, children pass between households. Some homes remain closed to outside observation, and many forms of hardship are easier to hide than public memory later admits. Joseph's story seems to have lived in one of those narrower worlds. That is why the old publicity campaign, broad as it was, did not produce the response police expected. The image was visible, the life behind it was not. This becomes even clearer when you consider how central ordinary institutions were to the original search. School attendance was important because regular school life creates a pattern. Medical visits matter because they leave records and bring a child into contact with adults outside the household. Church life matters because it puts families in recurring, semi-public settings. But if a child's contact with these institutions is inconsistent, hidden, or absent, then the social alarm system never fully engages. That seems to be part of the darkness at the center of this case. Not theatrical darkness, administrative darkness, domestic darkness. The kind created when a child's life remains too private for the ordinary notice of the world. After Joseph's identification, that old intuition gained greater force. It still did not answer every question. Police did not suddenly publish a complete account of his upbringing. They did not provide a neat map of every home he occupied or every adult who cared for him. But the family reconstruction suggested enough complexity to show why the old search may have been pointed in the wrong directions for years. Many early theories leaned toward institutional disappearance, an orphanage, a foster placement, a private adoption, a transient family unrelated by blood. Those ideas made sense because detectives were trying to explain silence. But Joseph's eventual identification suggests another route to silence. Not institutional detachment, but family compartmentalization. Not a child who lacked kin, but a child whose position inside kinship may have been uneven, hidden, or socially difficult in ways outsiders could not see. That difference is subtle, and it matters. A child outside family may generate institutional records. A child kept within family secrecy may generate almost none. That is a much harder problem for police, especially in 1957, especially before digital cross-referencing, genetic genealogy, and modern child welfare databases. It is also worth noting how much the original investigators got right in broad outline, even while failing to identify him. Their age estimate was close. Their sense that he may have lived on the margins of regular public systems appears, in hindsight, perceptive. Their decision to preserve evidence was crucial. Their refusal to simply discard the case after the first publicity failure gave later science something to work with. That does not erase the sadness of the delay. It does, however, complicate the idea of failure. The case went cold in practical terms, but it did not vanish from professional memory. It remained in cold file circulation. It was revisited. It was carried forward by enough official patience that a future breakthrough remained possible. That distinction matters because many cases truly disappear. This one did not. It stayed suspended. And suspension is different from abandonment. The detectives who kept it alive could not force the answer out of the records they had. What they could do was make sure the records were still there when better tools arrived. That is one of the least visible forms of care in criminal investigation. It rarely makes headlines. No one celebrates the officer who stores photographs correctly, preserves notes carefully, and resists pressure to purge an old file. But those choices create the future. In Joseph's case, they created the possibility that he would someday be identified at all. There is another human cost to a case like this staying open for decades. Public memory hardens around the mystery itself. The label becomes famous. The unanswered question becomes the story. And over time, the real child risks being flattened into a symbol of unsolved crime. That happened here to some extent. The phrase used for decades became so widely known that it almost replaced personhood. People remembered the case. Fewer people could imagine the specific child inside it. His name interrupts that flattening. Joseph Augustus Sorelli pulls the narrative back toward one life, one birth, one family history, one hidden sequence of years that have to be reconstructed with care. That is why the naming phase matters so much beyond pure identification. It restores investigative discipline. It reminds everyone that this was never only a famous unknown. It was a little boy whose biography became inaccessible. And because it became inaccessible, the case froze around the circumstances of discovery rather than the circumstances of living. Now, with his identity known, the imbalance can begin to correct. Investigators can ask what his daily life likely looked like, not in lurid detail, not as speculation for its own sake, but because daily life is the key to understanding why the alarm never sounded properly. Did he live in one household steadily, or move between adults? Was he known openly to neighbors, or kept mostly within the home? Did relatives outside his immediate caregivers know him by name, by sight, or only as an abstract family fact? Was there some social arrangement that discouraged people from speaking of him publicly? Those are the questions that begin after identification, and they are in some ways more difficult than the DNA work. DNA gives relation. Daily life requires reconstruction. Reconstruction requires witnesses, documents, and context. And context fades. This is why cold case detectives often sound careful, even at moments the public experiences as triumphant. They know what has been answered and what has not. In Joseph's case, the triumphant part was real. The child had his name back. The unanswered part was equally real. The larger why remained partly in shadow. Why did no immediate family member identify him in 1957? Why did no usable paper trail place him clearly before investigators during the first months? Why did the city need more than 6 decades in modern genealogy to do what ordinary recognition failed to do? Those questions still extend outward from the solved identity, and they return us again to the title. The case went cold because identity was trapped inside a private world while investigation operated in public systems. That is the shortest version. The longer version includes class, mobility, social stigma, the fragmented nature of mid-century records, and the practical limits of law enforcement communication across agencies and states. It includes the reality that some children were not integrated into school, medical, and community life in ways that generated reliable documentation. It includes the sad fact that adults sometimes keep children invisible. And it includes time itself, steadily converting possible witnesses into uncertain ones. All of these forces overlap in the file. None of them alone fully explains the coldness. Together they do. You can see this most clearly if you compare the early years with the modern breakthrough. In the early years, police asked the city to recognize a face. In the modern era, science asked biology to identify a lineage. The first method depended on visibility and cooperation. The second bypassed both. That contrast explains decades of failure in one stroke. The old investigation was built on social recognition. The successful one was built on genetic connection. A society can fail to recognize a child for many reasons. Biology, once preserved and carefully tested, is less vulnerable to fear, shame, forgetfulness, and administrative fragmentation. It does not tell the whole story, but it can open the locked door. Joseph's identification therefore becomes both a forensic achievement and a historical commentary. It shows what science can do. It also shows what social systems once could not do. If the city of Philadelphia had possessed today's tools in 1957, the file might never have entered cold storage in the same way. If there had been integrated digital birth records, searchable family linkages, broader interstate communication, and modern forensic genealogical techniques, his identity might have been recovered much sooner. But those things did not exist. What existed were paper files, local memory, and the moral hope that somebody would speak. Sometimes that was enough. Here, it was not. There is a temptation after a long unsolved case receives a partial answer to retell the whole history as though the ending was inevitable, as though the name had always been waiting neatly at the bottom of the stack. That is not fair to the real complexity of the case. Joseph's name was not waiting in a single discoverable document that detectives foolishly missed. It was buried behind relational gaps. The record of his birth existed, but the path from that record to the child found in Fox Chase was obstructed by all the missing context in between. That middle space is where the coldness lived, not in the existence of the answer, but in the inaccessibility of the route. And route matters in investigation. Knowing that a fact exists somewhere is not the same as being able to connect it lawfully and reliably to the case in front of you. This is why genealogical cold case work feels both modern and old-fashioned. At heart, it still involves patient connecting, one record to another, one person to a parent, one parent to a household, one household to an address. The science provides the opening. The detective work still has to build the road. Joseph's case required both. That is perhaps the most human thing about it. A city's memory carried him. Detectives preserved him. Scientists identified him. And yet no part of that process erased the long years when he remained known only through a phrase of uncertainty. Those years are part of the story too. They are not merely an empty stretch between discovery and solution. They reveal what happens when a case outlives the systems that first tried to solve it. The file changes caretakers. The evidence waits. Witnesses emerge late, then fade again. The public returns in waves of interest. Some theories become almost folklore. And beneath all of that, the actual child remains still, waiting for the one fact that can reorder everything. Joseph finally received that fact. Now the case could enter its next quiet phase, not the phase of asking who he was. That was answered, the phase of asking what his named life tells us about every prior failure to see him clearly. One thing it tells us is that the absence of a missing person report is never a simple fact. It can mean no one cared enough to make one. But it can also mean the people closest to the child were the very people from whom the truth needed to be recovered. It can mean no outside adult had enough stable contact to notice the disappearance. It can mean family structures were too fragmented for responsibility to be obvious. And in an era before strong child tracking systems, it can mean the bureaucracy had no easy point of entry. That is why so many early comparisons failed. Police were looking for a report that might never have existed in the form they needed. Or, if some report did exist somewhere, it may have been filed under circumstances too partial to match. A first name without a surname, a wrong age, a household address already changed, a family relationship inaccurately described, a child living under a different social identity from his legal one. These are not unusual obstacles in older child cases. They are ordinary enough to be frightening. And they all make a cold file heavier. The more you understand those obstacles, the less the case looks like an aberration, and the more it looks like a concentrated example of larger problems. Joseph's story was singular in its public impact, but the forces that chilled it were common: record fragmentation, domestic secrecy, institutional blind spots, the fading of witness certainty, the mismatch between public investigation and private family life. That may be the deepest answer to why the case endured for so long. It was not one mystery, it was a stack of smaller invisibilities, each protecting the next. Once science pierced one layer, the identity emerged. But the other layers did not disappear. They still shape what can be known about his last years, and they still shape how carefully investigators must proceed when discussing the family context after identification. There is also the question of expectation. For decades, the public imagined that if the boy were ever identified, the entire story would fall into place immediately. That is often not how old cases work. Identity and explanation move at different speeds. Sometimes the name arrives first, and the social truth behind the name remains difficult. In Joseph's case, that appears to be exactly what happened. The modern tools could say who he was. They could not instantly say why his existence had become so hidden, or who chose that hiddenness, or when the broader family lost sight of him. Those answers live in a different category of proof. They require narrative evidence. And narrative evidence is where time does the most damage. A dead relative cannot be cross-examined. A lost file cannot be recreated with certainty. A house long sold cannot tell investigators who entered and left on a winter evening in 1957. So the work becomes one of approximation bounded by discipline. What can be shown? What can only be inferred? What remains ethically uncertain? Good cold case investigators keep those categories separate. That is especially important when the case carries so much public emotion. Joseph's identification invited a new wave of media attention. Some coverage was careful. Some was eager to finalize a story that the evidence had not finalized. That is another challenge after a breakthrough. The public dislikes incompleteness. What investigators owe a case after a breakthrough is not excitement, but restraint. That is especially true when the breakthrough gives the public one answer, while leaving the central human explanation unsettled. Once Joseph's name was known, the case could no longer be discussed as a pure mystery of identity. It had to be discussed as a history with documents, relatives, timelines, and silences that now carried names instead of abstractions. That changed the burden on everyone involved. Police had to revisit the family tree with care. Journalists had to decide whether they were reporting facts or simply arranging old rumors around a new name. And the public had to accept something difficult, that a child can be identified with certainty and still remain partly unknown in the story of his own life. That is the quiet paradox at the end of this case. The biggest barrier fell. The rest did not fall with it. In practical terms, Joseph's identification allowed investigators to do what the original detectives had always wanted to do. They could begin from the child and move outward through the people around him, not through guesses, not through broad citywide appeals, through an actual lineage. That meant rechecking addresses. It meant rechecking family relationships. It meant asking who was where and when, and who likely had contact with Joseph during the final period of his life. That is slower than the public often imagines. Once a name is announced, people expect a complete chart to appear the next day. But old records do not arrange themselves neatly out of respect for a breakthrough. They still have to be gathered. They still have to be compared. And every comparison can create a new problem. A relative may be biologically connected, but have little useful knowledge. An address may be real, but linked to multiple overlapping family arrangements. A record may exist, but not answer the question investigators hoped it would answer. So the file, even after the announcement, remained a place of measured steps. That is another reason the case stayed emotionally unfinished. There was no final scene where everything locked into place. There was only a narrowing, a careful narrowing, and that narrowing told a more complex story than the old public imagination had allowed. For many years, people had asked why no one came forward. After Joseph was identified, that question became less rhetorical and more precise. Who exactly would have come forward? A parent? A relative? A neighbor? A doctor? A teacher? A church member? And which of those people, if any, had regular enough contact with Joseph to recognize him immediately from a newspaper photograph in 1957? That distinction matters. We sometimes talk about family as though it were one shared mind. It isn't. Families are full of compartments. Some people know everything, some know almost nothing. Some know only what they are told, and some are left outside the circle entirely. If Joseph lived inside one narrow compartment, then the original investigation may have been asking the wrong audience to solve the right problem. The city looked broadly. The truth may have lived narrowly. That is a powerful explanation for how the case hardened into a cold file. Not because the answer did not exist, because the answer sat in a place ordinary public recognition could not easily reach. There is also the uncomfortable fact that silence inside families is often stronger than silence between strangers. A stranger may hesitate, a family may withhold, a stranger may forget, a family may decide not to speak. And in older cases, especially those shaped by stigma, secrecy, or unstable living arrangements, the difference between those kinds of silence becomes crucial. Joseph's identification did not prove every theory the public had entertained, but it did confirm that the old puzzle was never simply a matter of a missing poster waiting to be matched. The problem was deeper. The social pathways that usually connect a child to the world, school, medicine, neighborhood life, open family acknowledgement, may not have been functioning in a reliable way around him. If those pathways are weak enough, then even a determined investigation can drift for decades around the edges of a life without ever entering it. That is what happened here. The detectives were not outside the truth because they lacked concern. They were outside it because the structure of the child's life kept them there. And that, in the end, is why the title question matters so much. Why did the boy in the box case go cold? It went cold because the evidence at the scene could only point toward domestic life, not identify it. It went cold because broad publicity can only work when someone in a position to recognize and speak is willing and able to do both. It went cold because mid-century records were fragmented, local, and often poor at tracing children whose lives did not move in predictable civic patterns. It went cold because time favored concealment. And it went cold because every year without a name turned memory into something softer, less exact, more vulnerable to rumor. None of those reasons alone would be enough to explain 65 years. Together they are. They make the case feel less like one impossible event and more like the accumulation of ordinary failures of visibility. A child hidden here, a record missed there, a household not examined from the inside because it could not be, a wider family that may not have known enough, a city relying on recognition while the truth remained private. That is how a case cools, not all at once, layer by layer. When people hear that modern science eventually identified Joseph Augustus Sorelli, there can be a temptation to imagine that science defeated the mystery entirely. It did not. It defeated one part of it, a very important part, the oldest part, but not all of it. Science could reconnect Joseph to his blood relatives. It could not automatically reconstruct the emotional and practical reality of his daily life. It could not tell investigators who chose silence, who lived at a distance, who knew and did not act, or who perhaps never had enough information themselves. Those questions belong to a different kind of evidence. Sometimes that evidence exists in records, sometimes in memory, sometimes in neither. And in an old case, many of the people who might once have clarified things are no longer here to ask. That means the final truth may always remain uneven, not false, just incomplete. That can be hard to accept, but it is part of being honest with a case like this. There is, however, one very clear consequence of the identification. The child no longer belongs only to the mystery. He belongs to history. He belongs to his own name. That changes the moral center of the story. For decades, the public encountered him through the label attached to the case. Now that label is secondary. Now there is Joseph, a boy born in January of 1953, a boy who lived for 4 short years in a world that did not bring him clearly into public view, a boy whose identity survived not in open memory, but in records and biology waiting for the tools that could finally connect them. That matters. It matters because cold cases can sometimes make people into symbols. A symbolic child, a symbolic file, a symbolic grave. Naming him interrupts that. It says, gently but firmly, that this was not only a haunting mystery from Philadelphia's past, it was one child's life, partially erased, then patiently restored in part. And that restoration was earned through decades of preservation by people who may never have expected to see the answer themselves. There is something deeply quiet about that kind of victory. No single detective solved the entire case in one flash of insight. No witness walked in at the perfect hour and explained everything. Instead, the answer arrived because many people, across many years, refused to let the file disappear. An officer stored evidence carefully. A department revisited the case instead of closing it in spirit. Researchers compared records. Forensic specialists recovered what they could. Genealogists built family lines branch by branch. Each of those acts was small on its own. Together, they became enough. That is often how old mysteries are moved, not by drama, but by continuity. Someone keeps the paper, someone keeps asking, someone keeps believing that the future may know more than the present can. Joseph's case is one of the clearest examples of that patience. The original detectives could not reach the answer. But because they protected the case rather than surrendering it to forgetfulness, later generations could. In that sense, the file never truly died. It slept, and then it woke under a different kind of light. Still, the sleep of a case is not harmless. While the file waited, decades passed. People died. Memories thinned. Institutions changed. Neighborhoods shifted. The city that found Joseph in 1957 was not the same city that named him in 2022. That long gap is part of the sorrow of the story. Justice delayed is not only justice postponed, it is also context lost. The answers that remain may now be partial because the years took so much with them. If the case had been solved in the first weeks, there might have been witnesses who could still place him clearly. If it had been solved in the first years, perhaps records still sitting in offices might have helped. If it had been solved before the older generations passed away, maybe family knowledge would have been less fractured. But it was not. It cooled, and cooling has costs. One of those costs is that some questions may now only be approached, not fully resolved. That is not defeat. It is simply the shape of time. So when you ask why the case went cold, the answer is not one sentence. It is a sequence. The child was found without a name. The city tried to identify him through recognition. Recognition failed. The police turned to objects, institutions, and comparison. Those methods narrowed possibilities, but did not cross into the hidden part of his life. The case entered preservation. Later theories generated interest, but not certainty. Then science returned, and identity was recovered through a route that had not existed at the beginning. That sequence explains not just this case, but many old ones. Cold cases often persist because the original question is being asked in the wrong language. The early language here was public memory. The successful language, decades later, was genetic lineage. One failed. One worked. And between them sat 65 years of careful waiting. There is another lesson in that, one that feels larger than this single file. A society tends to assume that children are easy to account for, that someone is always watching, that schools notice, that neighbors notice, that relatives notice, that paperwork notices. But old cases teach something less comfortable. They show that children can slip through the seams when enough small failures overlap. A child can be seen, but not formally known, cared for in some limited way, yet never securely documented. Present inside a household, yet absent from the structures that would later help identify him. Joseph's story seems to have lived in that narrow and dangerous space. That is why the case still feels so powerful. It is not only about one unsolved death, it is about what can happen when the ordinary systems of acknowledgement do not hold. And because of that, the mystery has always carried more than curiosity. It carries a kind of civic grief. A city asking itself how this could happen. A city asking why it took so long to say a child's true name. In the years since Joseph's identification, remembrance has changed tone. The cemetery matters differently now. The grave is no longer only a marker for an unknown child. It is a place where people can address him directly. That may seem simple. It is not. To say a name is to return a person to the human scale of the world. Not a riddle, not a headline, not a phrase preserved in archives. A boy. Joseph. That shift does not erase the old label from history, but it places it in its proper order. First, there was the child. Then there was the mystery. For a long time, the mystery came first. Now, at least in part, the child does. That may be the most humane outcome the case can offer. Even if every remaining question is never answered, that much has changed for good. And yet, because this story is honest, it cannot end by pretending the uncertainty is gone. The file remains partly open. Investigators still know more than the public knows, and perhaps less than they wish they knew. There are timelines still to test, family circumstances still to understand, old witness claims still to measure against the new framework. And behind all of that sits the question that naming alone cannot settle. Why was Joseph's life arranged in such a way that he could vanish from public recognition so completely? That is not a forensic question by itself. It is a human one. It touches family structure, secrecy, responsibility, the limits of institutions, the choices adults make around vulnerable children. It may be that parts of that answer are already visible inside the file. It may be that parts are gone forever. Cold cases often end that way, with one truth finally lit and another remaining in shadow beside it. If you sit with the story long enough, what stays with you is not only the sadness, it is the patience. The patient detective who revisits an old lead. The archivist who keeps the folder intact. The genealogist who traces one family line through old certificates and city directories. The quiet insistence that an unnamed child is still worth the work. That insistence is what carried Joseph across the decades. It is what kept the case from being reduced to folklore. And it is what finally made it possible for the city to say, after all that time, that he had not been lost completely. only hidden, only delayed, only waiting for a method the world had not yet invented. There is something almost tender in that, not in what happened, never that, but in the refusal to let the waiting become erasure. So the case did not go cold because no one cared. It went cold because care was working against barriers it could not yet cross. And when those barriers finally gave way, they gave way slowly. A box kept in evidence, a burial remembered, a file reopened, a sample tested, a family tree built, a name returned. That is the whole arc, or as much of it as we can honestly hold tonight. A mystery of identity became a mystery of silence. Then it became, at last, a child restored to history, though not yet fully explained. That is not closure. But it is not nothing. It is something solid, something earned, something gentle in the middle of all that old uncertainty. The road in Fox Chase is still there. The winter air would still settle low among the bare trees. Cars still pass, people still go about ordinary days, and somewhere in the long shelves of Philadelphia's memory, this case remains what it has always been, a lesson in how easily a life can disappear from the record, and how patiently the record can be asked to speak again. Now it has spoken part of the answer: Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a name where there was once only a question, and beside that